module, you should be able to identify how many organisms are required to cause a problem, state why multiplication in food is not essential, identify which bacteria is the most common cause of diarrhea in the UK, and lastly, know which bacteria will multiply significantly in a fridge. Foodborne diseases enter our digestive system by what's known as the fecal-oral route. In other words, they come from another human's or animal's intestines via their feces, and we've ingested that feces. Various types of foodborne diseases exist. Let's look at the bacteria and viruses that cause those diseases. The first one, and we'll go into these in some depth, Campylobacter, enteritis, Escherichia coli 0157, norovirus, Listeria, typhoid and paratyphoid, Hepatitis A, bacillary dysentery, Brucellosis, tuberculosis and parasites. On the slide, it gives you an example of how the foodborne disease or how the bacteria or virus can enter the system. And it shows raw sewage being pumped out into a water supply, and that water supply then being sprayed onto fruit. First of all, Campylobacter. Campylobacter enteritis is really the inflammation or the disease affecting the small intestine. Enteritis literally means inflammation of the intestine. So Campylobacter is the bacteria, Campylobacter enteritis is the disease. The incubation period for this bacteria is between 1 and 11 days, typically 2 to 5 days. Duration of the illness between 1 and 7 days. Symptoms include colicky, abdominal pain, diarrhea, often blood-stained. Vomiting is rare, usually accompanied by fever, so it does usually start with flu-like symptoms. And you get headaches and also nausea. And this bacteria is the most common cause of diarrhea in the UK. It composes mainly of Campylobacter jejuni, 90%, and Campylobacter coli, 10%. The growth range is between 28 and 46 degrees Celsius. Other characteristics include it's gram-negative, reduced oxygen is required for growth, there are no long-term carriers, it multiplies quickly between 37 and 43 degrees Celsius, but not below 28 degrees Celsius. Easily killed by cooking, and a very important thing here is around 500 organisms are required to cause illness. When we looked at food poisoning bacteria, we looked at millions causing illness rather than hundreds. Sources of this bacteria include animals and birds. Cross-contamination from raw poultry is common. It's common in the gut of poultry. Undercooked poultry or meat are the most likely food vehicles. Magpies to milk infection is common. Therefore, if you ever see milk bottles with the tops pecked, don't drink the milk because it's possibly been affected by Campylobacter. Also raw milk and untreated natural water. Common food vehicles include raw or undercooked poultry and meat, raw milk and contaminated water. Control factors include better hygiene in slaughterhouses, heat treatment of milk, thorough cooking to 75 degrees Celsius, better hygiene awareness of consumers, pet hygiene, avoiding cross-contamination from farm to fork or from farm to table, and lastly chlorination of water. E. coli 0157 or Escherichia coli 0157. The incubation period for this bacteria is 1 to 8 days, typically 3 to 4 days. Symptoms vary from watery diarrhea, nausea, abdominal pain, to bright red bloody diarrhea and severe abdominal cramps. It's responsible for causing serious illness in old and young. It's often fatal. Serious cases shorten life expectancy due to organ damage. And there was a case in 2005 in Derry in South Wales where a young lad, Mason Jones, died from E. coli 0157 because of infected meat from a butcher's in Bridgend on Tudors. Up to 30% of cases come down with hemolytic uremic syndrome, HUS. It's the major cause of acute renal failure, especially in children, but also in adults. In 1996 in Wishaw in Scotland, 21 people died because of E. coli food poisoning, and they were all old age pensioners. The growth rate of this bacteria is 3 to 46 degrees Celsius, optimum temperature about 37 degrees C. The duration of the illness is around 2 weeks unless there are complications, and again depending on the person, whether they're very young or old. Other characteristics include as a gram-negative rod. It requires a low infective dose, less than 100 bacteria. It's a facultative anaerobe and it's acid tolerant. It's destroyed by thorough cooking. Around 1,000 cases per year are reported in England and Wales, and it's more common in Scotland, and it's not easily diagnosed. Because this bacteria is acid tolerant, it can quite easily pass through the stomach's defense mechanism, i.e. the gastric juices, and settle into the small intestine. whereas it will start to grow and it will start to release poisons which then enter the bloodstream through the small intestine. Sources of E. coli include the intestines of animals, including cattle and sheep, and also man. Person to person is likely. Also from manured vegetables and fruit crops, and untreated water used for drinking and bathing, and also raw milk. Common food vehicles include cooked meat via cross-contamination, undercooked mince and burgers, mainly beef and lamb, raw milk, cheese made from unpasteurized milk, apple juice, and salad vegetables which have been contaminated with manure. Another example of E. coli food poisoning is from food handlers, or fruit pickers rather, who don't wash their hands after going to the toilet, especially on fruit farms, say picking apples, pears, strawberries, grapes and melons. These fruit farms tend to be large farms where there are no toilet facilities, so the fruit pickers tend to go to the toilet behind a hedge, don't wash their hands, and so any E. coli bacteria will be transferred from their hands to fruit. So always be careful when you buy fruit, even from a supermarket, always wash it well, because all the fruit that arrives at a supermarket is not washed or disinfected before it's sold. Control factors include prevention of cross-contamination, thorough cooking, especially mince and burgers, washing of salad vegetables and fruit, high standards of personal hygiene, especially in particular to hand washing, and strict segregation of raw and high-risk foods. Other control factors include avoiding untreated milk and apple juice, training of food handlers, increasing consumer awareness, and the use of effective hazard analysis. Because of the outbreak of E. coli 0157 in Wishaw in Scotland in 1996, with the subsequent deaths of 21 elderly people, Professor Hugh Pennington of Aberdeen University was asked by the government to put a report together with some recommendations to ensure that such an outbreak didn't happen again. And Hugh Pennington's recommendations were as follows. First of all, an education awareness programme for farm workers, consistent and rigorous enforcement of hygiene standards at slaughterhouses, including cleaner animals, HACCP and staff training, accelerated implementation of HACCP, including documentation, licensing of butchers and training, physical separation of raw meat and unwrapped cooked meat products and other ready-to-eat foods, improved food hygiene training for all food handlers, supervisory staff and one-person operations to be trained to at least intermediate level, further targeted and prioritised research, food hygiene training to be provided within the primary and secondary school curriculums, more resources to address enforcement and education awareness issues, especially related to the dangers of cross-contamination and eating undercooked products, and lastly, improved surveillance, research and control of outbreaks, including full written reports and consideration of their publication. There are several different types of viruses which cause foodborne disease. The norovirus or Norwalk pip virus, and there are also rotaviruses as well. Now these are 0.03 times the size of bacteria, so they're a lot smaller than bacteria. Very difficult to see with an optical microscope. It usually requires an electron microscope to see them. They multiply in living cells. They cannot multiply in food, like food poisoning bacteria. They may survive several days outside the living cell, even on dry surfaces. Millions are released on vomiting. They are mainly airborne and person-to-person infection is common, and they enter the digestive tract by the fecal-oral route, and there's only small numbers required, between 10 and 100 particles, so it's a low infective dose. The incubation period is between 10 and 50 hours. The symptoms include some diarrhea, vomiting, which is often projectile, abdominal pain, fever, nausea. Fatalities are rare and the symptoms are relatively mild. The duration is between 12 and 60 hours, usually 24 to 36 hours, and specimens are required within 48 hours. This is one of those bugs that we tend to call the winter vomiting bug or the 48-hour bug. The norovirus, up to 10% of the noroviruses are foodborne. With the rotavirus, they are the most common type of virus infection but are very rarely foodborne. Now, a foodborne disease is called foodborne because it can be transmitted in food or through water, but it doesn't grow with protein like food poisoning bacteria. Food vehicles, food that's handled frequently, sewage polluted water, especially when used to clean fruit, lettuce and shellfish. Control measures include using reputable suppliers of shellfish, excluding ill people and prevention of cross-contamination, and also thorough cooking to 75 degrees Celsius core temperature. This virus is also very common in closed or confined establishments such as cruise ships, prisons, classrooms, colleges. It's very easily dispersed by people with the infection actually sneezing or coughing in a small confined environment. And it lasts between 12 and 60 hours, but it disappears as quickly as it appears. Listeriosis is the name of the disease and is caused by the bacteria Listeria monocytogenes. The incubation period is 1 day to 3 months. Duration of the illness between 48 and 72 hours. Symptoms include a flu-like illness and general malaise, diarrhea and mild fever, septicemia, meningitis, especially in vulnerable groups, and abortion if the mother is affected. This is a psychotrophic bacillus. In other words, it grows quite easily at low temperatures. The growth range is between minus 1.5 degrees Celsius to 42 degrees Celsius. Other characteristics include it's gram-positive. The people most at risk are neonates, pregnant women, immunosuppressed persons, and the elderly. It tends to dominate other organisms at low temperatures. And with pregnant women, it's not so much the pregnant woman that's affected as the unborn child, because the bacteria implants itself into the placenta, so it prevents nutrients, oxygen getting to the unborn child. So it usually ends up either with the woman having to have an abortion, or having a miscarriage or a stillbirth. Sources of this bacteria include the intestines and feces of humans and animals, effluent and sewage sludge. There are many cases of cross-infection. It's a common environmental organism. Specific foods most susceptible are soft cheeses and pate, especially if they're made with unpasteurized milk, or if the pate is not cooked to high enough temperature to kill the bacteria. It's possible, however, on most foods, especially manure-contaminated vegetables. So again, if you do use vegetables raw, make sure you wash and scrub them well before use. Control factors for listeriosis include the efficient disposal of sewage, avoidance of cross-contamination, susceptible groups to avoid soft cheese and pate, and contact with farm animals, care with the shelf life of chilled foods, thorough cooking, effective cleaning and disinfection, and dry cleaning is preferred. Typhoid and paratyphoid, sometimes called enteric fever. Typhoid comes from the bacteria Salmonella typhi, and paratyphoid comes from the bacteria Salmonella paratyphi. So you've got an example there where Salmonella is both a foodborne disease and a food poisoning organism. The incubation period is 3 days to 1 month, typically 8 to 14 days. Duration of the illness is 1 to 8 weeks. Symptoms include fever, malaise, slow pulse, enlarged spleen, rose spots on trunk, constipation or severe diarrhea. Fatality rate is between 2 and 10%. That's for typhoid, i.e. Salmonella typhi. Up to 5% are permanent carriers. Other characteristics include it's present in feces and urine. Transmission, again as with most foodborne diseases, is via the fecal-oral route. Sources of this bacteria include feces and urine, also sewage, contaminated water and food, and from carriers. Control factors include using safe water supplies, the satisfactory disposal of sewage, heat treatment of milk, control over contaminated shellfish, so using approved and reputable suppliers, the exclusion of carriers, high standards of personal hygiene, especially good hand washing regimes, and the use of an effective food safety management system such as HACCP. Hepatitis A is another virus. In other words, it's very much smaller than bacteria, and it becomes part of the host cell, almost acting like a parasite. Now, there are about 8 different types of hepatitis, A through H. Hepatitis A, with about 1 or 2 others, are the only foodborne disease viruses. The other ones, you get infection due to blood infections, sexual contact, the use of shared needles, etc. Hepatitis literally means inflammation of the liver. So that's the main organ that this virus will attack, causing anything from inflammation to swollen liver to liver failure. The incubation period is between 15 and 50 days. Symptoms: there's an abrupt onset, fever, malaise, nausea, abdominal pain, and later jaundice. Obviously, jaundice is one of those symptoms where when the liver starts to fail, because the liver as well as the kidneys are the body's natural filters to remove all poisons, when the liver stops working, then the poisons stay within the body. Therefore, the jaundice is part of those symptoms. Duration of the illness is anywhere between 1 week and several months. The fatality rate is less than 1%. Again, it being a foodborne disease, it's transmitted via the fecal-oral route. Also, urine can be infected. Sources include carriers, and it's carried in their feces, urine and blood. Contaminated food, especially shellfish, salad vegetables and soft fruit. And also contaminated water. Control factors include the use of safe water supplies, satisfactory disposal of sewage, heat treatment of milk, exclusion of carriers, high standards of personal hygiene, especially with good hand washing regimes, avoiding suspect shellfish, the use of approved and reputable suppliers, and the careful washing of salad vegetables and soft fruit. Dysentery is caused by the organisms Shigella sinae and Shigella flexneri. The incubation period is between 1 and 7 days, typically 4 days. Duration of the illness is between 2 and 16 days. Symptoms include it's an acute disease, diarrhea, often containing blood, mucus and pus, fever, stomach cramps, often vomiting. The death rate is less than 1%. Shigella flexneri is more likely to be fatal than Shigella sinae. Outbreaks are fairly common in infant and junior schools, and is spread through the usual fecal-oral route because it's a foodborne disease. Sources include infected people, usually children of primary school age, contaminated food and water. Also, there has been cases from imported iceberg lettuces. Control factors include good personal hygiene, attention to washing hands effectively after using the toilet, cleaning and disinfection in toilet areas, general cleaning and disinfection, and the exclusion of carriers. Other control factors include the chlorination of water supplies, the effective disposal of sewage, heat treatment of milk, and avoiding shellfish from suspect waters, in other words using approved or reputable suppliers. Brucellosis or undulant fever is the disease caused by Brucella abortus and Brucella melitensis. The incubation period is between 5 and 21 days. Symptoms: it's an intermittent fever and it has flu-like symptoms and is extended depression and headache. Vets are particularly at risk from this bacteria, or from these bacteria, because there are two involved. TB or tuberculosis, again, is the disease caused by the bacteria Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Mycobacterium bovis. The incubation period is 4 to 6 weeks. Later stages may take years. It affects the lungs, bones, lymph nodes, kidneys, intestines and skin. And this disease is classed as a chronic bacterial disease. Chronic means it takes a long time to develop. Sources of both diseases include contact with an infected animal, usually a cow, ingesting raw milk and dairy products from infected herds, and person to person, especially with TB. Control factors for both brucellosis and tuberculosis. There was an eradication scheme introduced in the 60s and 70s, and heat treatment have reduced the problem greatly. Also, avoid raw milk and products made from raw milk. Other diseases not caused by bacteria or viruses include BSE, which is bovine spongiform encephalopathy. This is a neurological disease of cattle, and the epidemic started in 1986. In 1993 there are 1,000 cases per week. The causative agent is a prion, or a protein ion, which is resistant to heat, chemicals and irradiation. It's detected in the brain and nerve tissues of affected cattle and suspected in lymph tissue not isolated from muscle. In 1988 there was a ban on infected material in feed. In 1997, cattle over 30 months were slaughtered and incinerated. The transmission of this disease was thought to be from scrapie infected bone meal from sheep, and this was fed to the cattle. This vertical transmission of BSE is from cow to calf. Another disease is CJD, which is the human equivalent of BSE, and it stands for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And here there's usually a long incubation period, up to 40 years, and is fatal within a year. And with this there's a progressive decline in cognitive and motor functions of the brain. Giardiasis and cryptosporidiosis are protozoa. Giardiasis and cryptosporidiosis are the diseases. The protozoa causing these diseases are Giardia lamblia and Cryptosporidium. They enter our system via the fecal-oral route. Cysts of the protozoa persist in the environment and water. Cysts, if you like, are a bit like spores. Outbreaks are often from water contaminated with animal feces. The incubation period for Giardiasis is 6 to 22 days. For Cryptosporidiosis, it's around 10 days. In some parts of the Amazonian rainforest, some tribes eat the brains of their deceased relatives. It's part of their culture. They think that when the deceased relative dies, if they eat the brain of that relative, the energy or life force is transferred to the person eating the brain, and this has given rise to a disease called Kuru, which is a bit like CJD. It's caused by a prion or protein ion, and again there's a progressive decline in cognitive and motor functions of the brain, and it's usually fatal within a year. Other problematic organisms include parasites. A parasite is a plant or animal. It lives and feeds on or in another plant or animal known as the host. It can have complicated life cycles which may involve different hosts. Taenius saginata is a tapeworm. Trichinella spiralis are roundworms, and you'll find these in undercooked pork and horseflesh. So it's always important never to undercook pork. You must cook it to 75. With some meats like beef, lamb and duck, especially if it's a muscle joint, you can undercook so it's pink or rare, but never do that with pork because of this parasite. Fasciola hepatica is a liver fluke, and Echinococcus granulosus is a hydrated cyst. This slide looks at the comparison of food poisoning and foodborne disease. First of all, with food poisoning, millions of bacteria are required. With foodborne disease, only small numbers are required, so it could be called a low-dose pathogen or take a low infective dose. With food poisoning, bacteria multiply on food, within the nutrients, the protein. With a foodborne disease, food is only a vehicle. With food poisoning, vehicles other than food are unlikely. With foodborne disease, other vehicles are common. Food poisoning, person to person, is rare. Foodborne disease, person to person, is common. Food poisoning, airborne, is unlikely. With foodborne disease, airborne is common. Food poisoning normally has a short onset, happens quickly. Foodborne disease has a longer onset. And here are the key points for Lecture 5. Only a small number of foodborne disease organisms are required to cause a problem. Multiplication in food, in the protein, is not essential. Airborne and person-to-person spread is common. Pets, farm animals and birds are a common source of foodborne disease organisms. Campylobacter is the most common cause of diarrhea in the UK. Listeria can multiply significantly in a fridge. The Penitent report recommended certain areas which we looked at in quite detail.